Chapter 23 of The Young Diana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Young Diana by Marie Corelli. Chapter 23. Destiny having apparently taken sides with Diana in her new existence, she lost no time in availing herself of the varied and curious entertainment thrown in her way. The first thing she did on the next day but one of her arrival in London was to attempt a visit to her own former old home in Richmond, in order to see her bereaved parents. A private automobile from the hotel was supplied for her use at the hour she named in the afternoon, an hour when, she knew by old experience, her mother would be dozing on the sofa after lunch, and her father would be in a semi-somnolent condition over the day's newspaper. As she passed through the hotel lounge on her way to enter the car, she came face to face with her quondam lover, Captain the Honourable Reginald Cleeve, a heavily built, fairly good-looking man of about 50 or more. She wondered, as she saw him, what had become of the once rather refined contour of the features she had formerly admired, and why the eyes that had looked love into eyes that spake again were now so small and peepy, and half hidden under lids that were red and puffy. Dressed with a quiet elegance and simplicity, she moved slowly towards him. He was lighting a cigar and preparing to go out, but as he caught sudden sight of her he dropped the lit match with a "By Jove!" stamped its flame out under his foot, and hastening to the hotel door of exit, opened it, and, lifting his hat, murmured, "Allow me," with a glance of undisguised admiration. She bowed slightly and smiled her thanks. Her smile was most enchanting, creating as it were a dazzle of light in the eyes of those who beheld it. Then she passed out into the street, where the hotel porter assisted her into her automobile, and watched her being driven away till she had disappeared. Captain Cleeve strolled up to the hotel office where the manageress sat at her desk. He was on friendly terms with her, and could ask any question he liked. "Is that young lady staying here?" he now inquired. "The one who has just gone out?" "Yes, she came 2 days ago from abroad. A very beautiful girl, is she not?" Cleeve nodded. "Rather. I never saw anything like her. Do you know who she is?" "Her name is May. Miss Diana May," replied the manageress. "She was recommended here by— Dear me, is there anything the matter?" For Captain the Honourable had gone suddenly white, and as suddenly become violently red in the face, while he gripped the edge of the counter against which he leaned, as though afraid of falling. "No, he answered impatiently. "It's nothing. Are you sure that's her name, Diana May?" "Quite sure. The manager of our bank brought her here, explaining that she had just arrived from Switzerland, where she has been educated, I think, in the house of one of his own friends who lives in Geneva, and that she was, for the present, alone in London. He is looking out for a lady chaperone and companion for her. She has plenty of money." Cleeve pulled at his moustache nervously, then gave a forced laugh. "Curious," he ejaculated. "I used to know a girl named Diana May years ago. Before I was married. Not like this girl, no, though she was pretty. I wonder if she's any relation. I must ask her." "She seemed to know your name when she saw it in our register," said the manageress, "for she inquired if you and your family were staying here. I said yes, and did she know Mrs. Cleeve? But she replied that she did not." Captain the Honourable had become absent-minded and murmured "Oh!" and "Ah!" as if he were not paying very much attention. He strolled away and out into the street, with the name Diana May ringing in his ears, and the vision of that exquisitely lovely girl before his eyes. A dull spark of resentment sprang up in him that he should be a married man, with a wife too stout to tie her own shoes, and the father of children too plain-featured and ungraceful to be looked at a second time. "We are fools to marry at all," he inwardly soliloquized. "At 55 a man may still be a lover, and lover of a girl too, when long before that age a woman is done for." Meanwhile, Diana was having adventures of a sufficiently amusing kind, had she retained the capability of being amused by anything merely human. She arrived at her former old home a little on the outskirts of Richmond, and bade the driver of her automobile wait at the carriage gate, preferring to walk up the short distance of the drive to the house. How familiar, and yet unfamiliar, that wide sweep of neatly rolled gravel was, banked up on each side with rhododendrons, through which came occasional glimpses of smooth green lawn and beds of summer flowers. How often she had weeded and watered those beds, when the gardener went off on a booze, as had been his frequent custom, pretending he had been called away by the illness of a near relative. Pausing on the doorstep of the house, she looked around her. Everything was as it used to be, the whole place expressing that unctuous pride and neatness ordinary to the suburban villa adorned by suburban taste. She rang the bell, and a smart parlour-maid appeared, not one of the old staff, which had been under Diana's management. "Is Mrs. Polydore May in?" she asked. The maid perked a saucy head. The dazzling beauty of the visitor offended her. She had claims to a kind of music-hall prettiness herself. "Mrs. May is in, but she's resting and doesn't wish to be disturbed," she replied. "Unless you've some particular appointment—" "My business is very urgent," said Diana calmly. "I am a relative of hers, just returned from abroad. I must see her, or Mr. May." "Perhaps Miss Preston?" suggested the parlour-maid. Diana smiled. Miss Preston! Who was she? A new inmate of the household? A companion for Ma? And young enough for Pa? "Yes, Miss Preston will do," she said, and forthwith she was shown into a shady little morning-room, which she well remembered, where she used to tot up the tradesmen's books and sort the bills. A saucy-looking girl with curly brown hair rose from the perusal of a novel and stared at her inquiringly and superciliously. "I have called to see Mrs. May," she explained, "on very particular and personal business." "What name?" inquired the girl with a stand-offish air. "The same as her own. Kindly tell her, please. Miss May." "I really don't know whether she will see you," said the girl carelessly. "I am her secretary and companion." "So I imagine." And Diana, without being asked, sank gracefully into an easy-chair, which she remembered as comfortable. "I was also her secretary and companion, for some time. She knows me very well." "Oh, in that case. But does she expect you?" "Hardly." And Diana smiled. "But I'm sure she'll be glad to see me. You are Miss Preston? Yes? Well then, Miss Preston, do please go and tell her." At that moment a loud voice called, "Lucy! Lucy! Where's my pipe?" Diana laughed. "The same old voice," she said. "That's Mr. May, isn't it? He's calling you. And he doesn't like being kept waiting, does he?" Miss Preston's face had suddenly flushed very red. I'll tell Mrs. May," she stammered, and hurriedly left the room. Diana gazed about her on all the little familiar things she had so often dusted and arranged in their different places. They were all so vastly removed now in association that they might have been relics of the Stone Age, so far as she was concerned. All at once the door opened, and a reddish face peered in, adorned with a white terrier moustache. Then a rather squat body followed the face, and Pa stood revealed. With an affable, not to say engaging air, he said, "I beg your pardon? Are you waiting to see anyone?" Diana rose, and her exquisite beauty and elegance swept over his little, sensual soul like a simoon. "Yes," she answered, sweetly, while he stared like a man hypnotized. "I want to see Mrs. May." And you. Me? He responded, eagerly. I am only too charmed. But I had better speak to Mrs. May first, she continued. I have something very strange to tell her about her daughter. Her daughter. Our daughter. My poor Diana. And Mr. May immediately put on the manner of a pious grocer selling short weight. Her darling was drowned last summer. Drowned while bathing in a terrible cove on the Devon coast. Terrible. And she was so... Young? Suggested Diana sympathetically. No, not exactly young. She was not a girl like you. No, but she was so useful, so adaptable. And you have something strange to tell us about her? Well, why not begin with me? He approached her more closely with a conquering smile. She repressed her inclination to laugh, and said, seriously, No, I really think I had better explain matters to Mrs. May first, and I should like to be quite alone, please, without Miss Preston. At that moment Miss Preston returned and said, Mrs. May will see you. Then, addressing Mr. May, she added, This lady says she is some relative of yours. Her name is May. Mr. James Polydor's small grey-green eyes opened as widely as their lids would allow. Relative? He repeated. Surely you are mistaken. I hardly think. Please don't perplex yourself, said Diana sweetly. I will explain everything to Mrs. May. She will remember. Can I go to her now? Certainly. And Mr. May looked bewildered, but was too much overwhelmed by his visitor's queenly air and surpassing loveliness to collect his wits, or ask any very pressing questions. Let me show you the way. He preceded her along the passage to the drawing-room where Mrs. May, newly risen from the sofa, stood waiting to receive her mysterious caller, fatter and flabbier than ever, and attired in an ill-fitting grey gown with touches of black about it by way of the remainder of a year's mourning. Diana knew that old grey gown well, and had often deplored its cut and generally hopeless floppiness. "Margaret," announced Mr. May with a jaunty air, "here is a very charming young lady come to see you, Miss May." Then to Diana, "As you wish to have a private talk, I'll leave you and return in a few minutes." "Thanks very much," answered Diana, and the next moment the door closed and she was left alone with her mother. No emotion moved her, not a shadow of tenderness. She only just wondered how she ever came to be born of such a curious-looking person. Mrs. May stared at her with round, unintelligent eyes like those of a codfish just landed. "I have not the pleasure," she began. Diana advanced a step or two, holding out her hands. "Don't you know me?" she said at once. "Mother?" Mrs. May sidled feebly backwards like a round rickety table on coasters, and nearly fell against the wall. "Don't you know my voice?" went on Diana. "The voice you have heard talking to you for over 40 years? I am your daughter, your own daughter, Diana. I am indeed. I was not drowned, though I let you all think I was. I ran away because I was tired of my humdrum life at home. I went abroad for a year, and I have just come back. Oh, surely something will tell you I am your own child. A mother's instinct, you know." And she laughed. A little laugh of chilliest satire. "I have grown much younger, I know. I will tell you all about that and the strange way it was done. But I'm really your Diana, your dear drowned girl. I am waiting for you to put your arms round me and tell me how glad you are to have me back alive and well." Mrs. May backed closer up against the wall and thrust both her hands out in a defensive attitude. Her gooseberry eyes rolled in her head, her small, pursy mouth opened as though gasping for air. Not a word did she utter till Diana made a swift, half-running step towards her, when she suddenly emitted a shrill scream like a railway whistle, another and yet another. There was a scamper of feet outside. Then the door was thrown open and Mr. May and Miss Preston rushed in. What's the matter? What on earth is the matter? They cried, simultaneously. Mrs. May, cowering against the wall, pointed at her beautiful visitor. "Get her away! Take hold of her!" she yelled. "Get hold of her quick! Send for the police! She's mad! You've let a lunatic into the house. She's run away from some asylum. Lucy Preston, you ought to be ashamed of yourself to let her in. James, you're a fool. Another wild scream. Look how she's staring at me. She says she's my daughter, Diana, my daughter, who was drowned last year. She's stark, raving, mad. James, send for a doctor and a policeman to remove her. Take care. She may turn round and bite you. You never can tell. Oh dear. Oh dear. To think that with my weak heart, you should let a mad girl into the house. Oh, cruel, cruel. And to think she should imagine herself to be my daughter, Diana. Diana drew herself up like a queen addressing her subjects. I am your daughter, Diana, she said, though how I came to be born of such people I cannot tell, for I have nothing in common with you. But I have told you the truth. I was not drowned on the Devon coast in that cove near Rose Lee, as I led you to imagine. I was tired of my life with you and ran away. I have been in Switzerland for a year and have just come back. I thought it was my duty to show myself to you alive, but I want you as little as you want me. I will go. Goodbye. Goodbye, you who were my mother." As she said this, Mrs. May uttered another yell and showed signs of collapsing on the floor. Miss Preston hurried to her assistance, while Mr. May, his knees shaking under him, for he was an arrant coward, ventured cautiously to approach the beautiful, escaped lunatic. There, he murmured soothingly. He had an idea that there was a panacea for all the emotions of the sex feminine. Come, now, come with me, like a good girl. Be reasonable and gentle. I'll take care of you. You know, you are not allowed to go wandering about by yourself like this, with such strange ideas in your head. Now, come along quietly, and I'll see what I can do." Diana laughed merrily. "Oh, Pa, poor old Pa, just the same Pa. Don't trouble yourself and don't look so frightened. I won't bite you. My car is waiting and I have to be back at the hotel in time for dinner." And she stepped lightly along out of the drawing-room without one backward glance at the moaning Mrs. May, supported by Miss Preston, while James Polydore followed her, vaguely wondering whether her mention of a car in waiting might not be something like crazed Ophelia's call for, "Come, my coach." Suddenly she said, "Is Grace Laurie still with you?" He stared, thoroughly taken aback. "Grace Laurie? My wife's maid? She married and went to Australia 6 months ago. How could you know her?" "As your daughter Diana I knew her, of course," she replied. "Poor Grace. She was a kind girl. She would have recognized my voice, I'm sure. Is it possible you don't?" "I don't indeed," answered Pa cautiously, while using his best efforts to get her out of the house. Come. I'm very sorry for you. You are evidently one of those lost identity cases, of which we hear so often. And you are far too pretty to be in such a sad condition of mind. For, you see, you don't know yourself, and you don't know what you're talking about. My daughter Diana was not like you at all. She was a middle-aged woman, over 40. So she was, so she is, said Diana. I'm over 40, but, Pa, why give yourself away? It makes you so old. She threw him such a smile and such a glance of arrowy brilliancy that his head whirled. Poor child, poor child, he mumbled, taking her daintily gloved hand and patting it. Far gone. Far gone indeed. And so beautiful too. So very beautiful. Here he kissed the hand he had grasped. There. You are almost normal. Be quite good. Here we are at the door. Now, are you sure you have a car? Shall I come with you? Diana drew her hand away from her father's hold, and her laugh, silvery sweet, rang out in a little peal of mirth. No, Pa, fond as you are of the ladies, you cannot make love to your own daughter. The prayer book forbids it. Besides, a mad girl is not fit for your little gallantries. You poor dear. 1 year has aged you rather badly. Aren't you a little old for Miss Preston? A quick flush overspread James Polydor's already rubicund countenance, and he blinked his eyes in a special manner which he was accustomed to use when feigning great moral rectitude. More than ever convinced that his visitor was insane, he continued to talk on in blandly soothing accents. I see your car, and no one with you. Dear, I wish I could escort you to wherever you are going. No, you don't. Not just now, said Diana, laughing. You're too scared, but perhaps another time. She swung lightly away from him and moved with her floating grace of step along the drive to the carriage gate, where the car waited. The driver jumped down and opened the door for her. She sprang in, while James Polydor, panting after her, caught the chauffeur by the coat sleeve. I don't think this young lady knows where she is going, he said confidentially. Where did you find her? The chauffeur stared. She's at our hotel, he answered, and I'm driving her back there. Here Diana put her head out of the window, her fair face radiant with smiles. You see, it's all right, she said. Don't bother about me. You know the blank hotel looking over the park? Well, I'm there just now, but not for long. No, I'm sure not for long, thought the bewildered James Polydor. You'll be put in a home for mental cases if you haven't run away from one already. And it was with a great sense of relief that he watched the chauffeur winding up and preparing to move off. The lunatic would have no chance to bite him, as his wife had suggested. But how beautiful she was! For the life of him he could not forbear treating her to one of his conquering smiles. Goodbye, dear child, he said. Take care of yourself. Be quite good. I will come and see you at your hotel. Diana laughed again. I'm sure you will. Why, Pa dear, you won't be able to keep away. The antique Mrs. Ross Percival, whom you so much admire, is not the only beautiful woman in London. Do remember that. Ta-ta! The car moved rapidly off, leaving James Polydor in a chaotic condition of mind. He was, of course, absolutely convinced that the girl who called herself his daughter Diana was the victim of a craze, but how or when she became thus obsessed was a mystery to him. He re-entered his house to struggle with the wordy reproaches of his better half, and to talk the matter over privately with the companion secretary, Lucy Preston, whose attention he thought more safely assured by the tete-a-tete, which apparently obliged him to put his arm round her waist and indulge in sundry other agreeable endearments. But the exquisite beauty of the escaped lunatic haunted him, and he made up his mind to see her again at all costs, mad or sane, and make searching inquiries concerning her. Diana herself, speeding back to her hotel, realized afresh the immensity of the solitude into which her new existence plunged her. Her own father and mother did not recognize her. Her most trusted friend, Sophie Lansing, refused to acknowledge her identity? Well, she was indeed born again, born of strange elements in which things human played no part, and she must needs accept the position. The saving grace of it all was that she felt no emotion, neither sadness nor joy, neither fear nor shame. She was, or she felt herself to be, a strange personality apart from what is understood as human life, yet conscious of a life superior to that of humanity. If a ray of light hovering above a world of shadows could be imagined as an entity, a being, such would most accurately have described her curious individuality. That same evening her banker called upon her, bringing with him a pleasant, motherly-looking lady whom he introduced as Mrs. Beresford, a widow, whose straitened circumstance made her very anxious to obtain some position of trust with an adequate salary. Her agreeable and kindly manners, gentle voice, and undeniable good breeding impressed Diana at once in her favour, and then and there a settlement between them was effected, much to the relief and satisfaction of the worthy banker, who, without any hesitation, said that he could not rest till he felt sure Miss May was under good protection and care, at which she laughed a little but expressed her gratitude as prettily as any girl might be expected to do. She invited him and her newly engaged chaperone to dine with her, and they all three went down to the hotel dining-room together, where, of course, Diana's amazing beauty made her the observed of all observers. Especially did Captain the Honourable Reginald Cleeve, seated at a table with an alarmingly stout wife and two equally alarmingly plain daughters, stare openly and admiringly at the fair enchantress with the wonderful sea-blue eyes and dazzling complexion, and deeply did he ruminate in his mind as to how he could best approach her, and ask whether she happened to be any relative to the Diana May he had once known. He made an opportunity after dinner, when she passed through the lounge-hall with her companions, and paused for a moment to look at the programme of entertainments in London, displayed for the information of visitors. "Pray excuse me," he said. "I chanced to hear your name. May I ask—" "Anything," Diana answered, smiling, while Mrs. Beresford, already alert, came closer. I used to know," went on the captain, becoming rather confused and hesitating. "Miss Diana May. I wondered if you were any relative?" "Yes, indeed," said Diana cheerfully. "I am quite a near relative. Do come and see me tomorrow, will you? I have often heard of Captain Cleeve, and his dear wife, and his sweet girls. Yes, do come. Mrs. Beresford and I will be so pleased." Here she took her new chaperone's arm and gave it a little suggestive squeeze, by way of assuring her that all was as it should be, and with another bewildering smile and a reiterated "Do come," she passed on with her banker, who had become a little stiff and standoffish at the approach of Captain Cleeve, and Mrs. Beresford, and so disappeared. Cleeve tugged vexedly at his moustache. "A near relative, is she? Then she knows, or perhaps not. She's too young, not more than 18 at most. And the old Diana must be quite 45. Hang it all, this girl might be her daughter. But old Diana never married, just like some old maids faithful to a memory." He laughed. "By Jove, I remember now. She got drowned last year, old Diana did, drowned somewhere in Devonshire. I read about it in the papers and thought what a jolly good thing. Poor old Diana. and this little beauty is a near relative, is she? Well, we'll see. Tomorrow. But when tomorrow came, it brought him no elucidation of the mystery. Diana had left the hotel. The manageress explained that through Mrs. Beresford she had heard of a very charming furnished flat which she thought would suit her, and which she had suddenly decided to take, and she had gone to make the final arrangements. "She left this note for you," said the manageress, handing Cleeve a letter. "She remembered she had asked you to call on her this afternoon." He took the letter with a sudden qualm of nerves. It was simple enough. "Dear Captain Cleeve," it ran, "so sorry to put you off, but Mrs. Beresford and I are taking a flat, and we shall be rather busy for the next few days, putting things in order. After that, will you come and see me at the above address? Yours sincerely, Diana May." That was all. But while reading it, Captain the Honourable's head swam round and round, as if he were revolving in a wheel. For, though the letter purported to come from a young Diana, the handwriting, the painfully familiar handwriting, was that of the old Diana. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Young Diana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Young Diana by Marie Corelli. Chapter 24. Genius takes a century or more to become recognized. But beauty illumines this mortal scene as swiftly as a flashlight. Brief it may be, but none the less brilliant and blinding, and men who are for the most part themselves unintelligent, and care next to nothing for intellectuality, go down like beaten curs under the spell of physical loveliness, when it is united to a dominating consciousness of charm. Consciousness of charm is a powerful magnet. A woman may be beautiful, but if she is of a nervous or retiring disposition and sits awkwardly in the background, twiddling her thumbs, she is never a success. She must know her own power, and, knowing it, must exercise it. Old Diana May had failed to learn this lesson in the days of her girlhood. She had believed, with quite a touching filial faith, in the pious and excessively hypocritical twaddle her father talked, about the fascination of modest, pretty girls who were unconscious of their beauty, with the result that she had seen him, with other men, avoid such modest, pretty girls altogether, and pay devoted court to immodest, loud, and impertinent women who asserted their made-up good looks with a frank boldness which drew the men on like a shoal of herrings in a net, and left the modest, pretty girls out in the cold. Old Diana had, by devotion to duty and constancy in love, missed all her chances, but the young Diana, albeit of mature years, knew better now than to miss anything. She was mistress of her own situation so completely that the hackneyed expression of "all London at her feet" for once proclaimed a literal truth. London is, on the whole, very ready to have something to worship. It is easily led into a craze. It is a sort of Caliban among cities, a monster that capers in drink and curses in pain, having, as Shakespeare says of his uncouth creation, a forward voice to speak well of his friend, and a backward voice to utter foul speeches and detract. But for once London was unanimous in giving its verdict for Diana May as the most beautiful creature it had ever seen. Photographers, cinema producers, dressmakers, tailors, jewellers besieged her. She was like the lady of the Breton legend, who lived at the top of a brazen tower, too smooth and polished for anyone to climb it, or for any ladder to be supported against it, and whose face at the window drove all beholders mad with longing for the unattainable. One society versifier made a spurt of fame for himself by describing her as a maiden goddess moulded from a dream, whereat other society versifiers were jealous, and made a little commotion in the press by way of advertisement. But Diana herself, the centre of all this stir, showed no sign of either knowing or appreciating the social excitement concerning her, and her complete indifference only made her more desirable in the eyes of her ever-increasing crowd of admirers. Once established in her flat with her chaperone, Mrs. Beresford, she lived the most curiously removed life from all the humanity that surged and seethed around her. The few appearances she made at operas, theatres, restaurants, and the like, were sufficient to lift her into the sphere of the recognized and triumphant beauty of the day. Coarse and vulgar seemed all the faked portraits of the half-nude sirens of stage and music-hall in the pictorial press, compared with the rare glimpses of the ethereal, almost divine loveliness which was never permitted to be copied by any painter or photographer. Once only did an eager cameraman press the button of his snapshot machine face to face with Diana as she came out of a flower show. She smiled kindly as she passed him, and he thought himself in heaven. But when he came to develop his negative, it was fogged, as though it had had the light in front of it, instead of behind it, as photography demands. This accident was a complete mystification, as he had been more than usually careful to take up a correct position. However, other photographers were just as unfortunate, and none were able to obtain so much as a faint impression of the fair features which dazzled every male beholder who gazed upon them. Artists, even the most renowned R.A.s, were equally disappointed. She, the unapproachable, the cold, yet enchanting, maiden goddess moulded from a dream, would not sit to any one of them, would not have anything to do with them at all, in fact, and fled from them as though she were a Daphne pursued by many Apollos. A very short time sufficed to surround her with a crowd of adorers and would-be lovers, chief and most persistent among them being Captain the Honourable Reginald Cleeve, and that antique Adonis, her father, James Polydore May. The worthy James had all his life been in the habit of forming opinions which were diametrically opposed to the opinions of everyone else, and pursuing this course always to his own satisfaction, he had come to the conclusion that this Diana May, who declared herself to be his daughter, was an artful demi-mondaine and an adventuress with a craze. He had frequently heard of people who imagined themselves to be the reincarnated embodiments of the dead. "Why, God bless my soul, I should think so," he said to a man at the club who rallied him about his openly expressed admiration for the new beauty, who bore the same name as that of his drowned daughter. "I met a woman once who told me she was the reincarnation of Cleopatra. Now, this girl, just because she happens to have my name, sticks to her idea that she is my Diana." "You'd like her to be, wouldn't you?" chuckled his friend. "But if she takes you for her father—" "Oh, she does. Poor child, she does." And James Polydore May sighed. "You would hardly believe it." "Why not?" And the friend chuckled again. "You're quite old enough." With this unkind shot from a bent bow of malice he went off, leaving James Polydore in an angry fume. For he, James, was not old. He assured himself. He was not old. He would not be old. His wife was old. Women age so quickly. But he, why, he was in the prime of life. All men over 60 are, in their own opinion. The beautiful Diana had ensnared him, and his sensual soul being of gross quality was sufficiently stimulated by her physical charm to make him eager to know all he could of her. She herself had not been in the least surprised when he found out her address and came to visit her. The presence of Mrs. Beresford rather disconcerted him. That lady's quiet good sense, elegant manners, and evident affection for the lovely girl she chaperoned were a little astonishing to him. Such a woman could not be the keeper of a lunatic. Diana never entered into the matter of her relationship with James Polydore to Mrs. Beresford. It entertained her more or less ironical humour to see her own father playing the ardent admirer, and whenever Mr. May called, as he often did, she always had some laughing remark to make about her old relative, who was, she declared, rather a bore. Mrs. Beresford was discreet enough to ask no questions, and so James Polydore came and went, getting no forwarder with the fair one, notwithstanding all his efforts to make himself agreeable, and to dislodge from her mind the strange obsession which possessed it. One day he went to see Sophie Lansing, never a favourite of his, and tried to find out what she thought of the Diana May, whose name was now almost one to conjure with. But Sophie had little patience to bestow on him. "Unadventurous, of course," she declared. "I am surprised you don't take the trouble to prosecute her for presuming to pass herself off as your daughter. And I'll tell you this much, Diana, your Diana, never was drowned." James Polydore's mouth opened. He stared, wondering if he had heard aright. "Never was drowned?" he echoed, feebly. "No, never was drowned," repeated Sophie, firmly. "She ran away from you, and no wonder. You were always a bore, and she was always being reproached as an old maid and in the way. She slaved for you and her mother from morning till night, and never had a kind word or a thank you. I advised her to break away from the humdrum life you made her lead, and on that morning when you thought her drowned, she came to me. Ah, you may stare. She did. She saw an advertisement in a French paper of a scientist in Geneva wanting a lady assistant to help him in his work, and she went there to try for the situation, and got it. I rigged her out and lent her some money. She's paid it all back, and for all I know she's in Geneva still, though she's under an agreement not to write to anyone, or give her address. She's been gone a year now." Mr. May's dumpy form stiffened visibly. "May I ask," he said, pompously, "may I ask, Miss Lansing, why you have not thought proper to communicate these strange circumstances to me before?" Sophie laughed. "Because I promised Diana I wouldn't," she answered. "She knew and I knew that you and Mrs. May would be perfectly happy without her. She has taken her freedom, and I hope she'll keep it." "Then my daughter is presumably still alive?" he said. "And instead of dying, she has, deserted us?" "Exactly," replied Sophie. "I would give you the name of the scientist for whom she is or was working, only I suppose you'd write and make trouble. When I had, as I thought, a letter from her the other day, saying she was returning to London, I got everything ready here to receive her, but when this artful girl turned up—" "Oh, the girl came to see you, did she?" Mr. May mumbled. The adventuress." "Of course she did, and actually brought me my watch bracelet, one I had lent to Diana, as a sort of proof of identity. But of course nothing can make a woman of 40 a girl of 18. Mr. May put his hand to his bewildered head. No, of course not. I must tell Mrs. May our daughter is alive. It will be a shock, a surprise." "No doubt," said Sophie sharply. "But she's dead to you. Remember that. If I didn't fear to make trouble for her, I'd wire to her employer at Geneva about this pretender to her name, only it wouldn't do any good, and I'd rather not interfere. And I advise you not to go dangling after the new beauty, as she's called. You really are too old for that sort of thing." Mr. May winced. Then he drew himself up with an effort at dignity. "I shall endeavour to trace my daughter," he said, "and I regret I cannot rely on your assistance, Miss Lansing. You have deceived us very greatly." "Twaddle!" interrupted Miss Lansing, defiantly. "You made Diana wretched, and she'd have gone on housekeeping for you till she had lost all pleasure in living. Now she's got a good salary in a situation which is satisfactory, and I'll never help you to drag her back to the old jog-trot of attending to your food and comfort. So there! As for this bogus Diana, the best thing you can do is to go and tell her you know all about it, and that she can't take you in any more." "She's the most beautiful thing ever seen," he said suddenly and with determination. Sophie Lansing gave him an all-over glance of utter contempt. "What's that to you if she is?" she demanded. "Will you never recognize your age? She might be your daughter, almost your granddaughter, and you want to make love to her? Bah!" With a scornful sweep of her garments, she left him, and he found his way out of the house more like a man in a dream than in a reality. He could hardly believe that what she had told him was true, that Diana, his daughter Diana, was alive after all. He wondered what effect the news would have on his wife. After so much mourning and expressions of terrible shock, the whole drowning business was turning into something of a comedy. "Miss Lansing ought to be ashamed of herself," he thought indignantly. "A regular hypocrite. Why, she wrote a letter of sympathy and deep sorrow for the loss of her darling Diana. Disgraceful. And if the story is true, and Diana has really run away from us, we should be perfectly justified in disowning her." Full of mingled anger and bewilderment, he decided to go and see the adventuress, known as Diana May, and tell her all. She would not, he thought, pretend any longer to be his daughter if she knew that his daughter was living. He found her in the loveliest of rest gowns, reclining on a sofa with a book in her hand. She scarcely stirred from her attitude of perfect ease as he entered, except to turn her head round on her satin pillow and smile at him. Quite unnerved by that smile, he sat down beside her, and taking her hand raised it to his lips. "What a gallant little paw it is," she observed lazily. "I wonder what Ma would say if she saw you." He put on an air of mild severity. "My dear girl," he said, "I wish you would stop all this nonsense and be sensible. I have heard some news today which ought to put an end to your pretending to be what you are not. My daughter, my real daughter Diana, is alive." Diana laughed. "Of course, very much so. I should not be here if she were not. Do I seem dead?" He made a gesture of impatience. "Tut, tut, if you will persist." "Naturally I will persist," she said, sitting up on the sofa, her delicate laces falling about her like a cloud, and her fair head lifted like that of a pictured angel. "I am Diana. I suppose you've been seeing Sophie Lansing. She's the only living being who knows my story, and even she doesn't recognize me now. But I can't help her obstinacy, or yours. I am Diana." "My daughter," said Mr. May, with emphasis, "is in Geneva." "Was," interrupted Diana, "and is here." Mr. May gave a groan of utter despair. "Oh, no use, he said. "One might as well argue with the wind as with one of these mentally obsessed persons. Perfectly hopeless. Hopeless." Diana sprang off her sofa and stood erect, confronting him. "See here," she said. "When I lived at home with you, sacrificing all my time to you and my mother, and only thinking of my duty to you both, you found me in the way. Why? Merely because I was growing old. You never thought there was any cruelty in despising me for a fault which seems common to all nature. You never cared to consider that you yourself were growing old. No, for you still seek to play the juvenile and the amorous. What you men consider legitimate in your own sex, you judge ridiculous in ours. You look upon me as young, when in very truth I am of the age of the same Diana whom, as your daughter, you wearied of. But youth has been given to my mature years, in a way which you in your ignorance of all science would never dream of. You, like most men, judge by outward appearances only. The physical, which is perishable, attracts you, and you have no belief in the spiritual, which is imperishable, but the spiritual wins." Mr. May sat winking and blinking under this outburst, which was to him entirely incomprehensible, though he was uncomfortably conscious of the radiance of eyes that played their glances upon him like beams from fiery stars. There, he said at last, nervously, resorting to his usual soothing formula. You are overwrought, a little hysterical. A sudden access of this unfortunate, mistaken identity trouble. I will come back and talk to you another day. Why should you come back? She demanded. What do you want of me? James Polydore was somewhat confused by this straight question. What indeed did he want of her? He was too much of a moral coward to formulate the answer, even to himself. She was beautiful, and he wanted to caress her beauty. Old as he was, he would have liked to kiss that exquisite mouth, curved like a rose petal, and run his wrinkled fingers through the warm and lavish gold of the hair that waved over the white brow and small ears like rippling sunshine. He was afflicted by the disease of senile amorousness for all women, but for this one in particular he was ready and eager to go to all lengths of fatuous foolishness possible to an old man in love, if he could only have been sure she was not insane. While he stood hesitating, and twitching his eyelids in the peculiar manner he affected when he had thoughts to conceal, she answered her own question for him. You want to make love to me, she said. As I have told you before, that can't be done. I am your daughter. Deny it as you may to the end, nothing can alter the fact. Do you remember the man I was engaged to? Captain Cleeve, the Honourable Reginald Cleeve? At this he was fairly startled, and he gave a gasp of astonishment. I remember the man my daughter was engaged to, he said. His name was Cleeve, but he is married. Very much so, and Diana smiled. But that doesn't prevent his making love to me, and I let him do it. You see, he's no relation, and I don't consider his fat wife any more than he considered me when he married her and threw me over. But he's like you. He doesn't believe I'm the old Diana. Of course not. And Mr. May expanded his chest with a long breath of superior wisdom. I should like to see him and talk to him about you and your sad condition of mind. No doubt you would, but you won't, said Diana calmly. I have forbidden him to go near you for the present. He dare not ask any questions about me till I have done with him. What a look there was in her eyes! James Polydore shrank under it as though it blinded him. Dare not? Done with him? He echoed stupidly. She laughed, quite sweetly. Oh, there, poor Pa, do go home. Pay your attentions to my mother's companion, Miss Preston. If she really likes your endearments, why, then, crabbed age and youth may live together. Poor mother, she never found out all your little ways. Some of them she discovered by chance, but I knew them all. What would you give to be as young as I am at your age? Too late, ye cannot enter now. Her laughter rang out again. Then approaching him, she laid her hands lightly on his shoulders and kissed him. There, that's a true daughter's kiss. Make the best of it, dear Pa. Go home and be a good, nice, moral old man. Sit on one side of the fireplace with Ma on the other and settle down into Darby and Joan. Such a nice couple, with a dash of Miss Preston between to keep up your spirits. And don't come back here, ever. Unless you accept the true position we occupy of father and daughter, father growing old and daughter growing young. Standing in the centre of the room, with the soft ivory chiffon and lace of her rest gown trailing about her like the delicate cirri floating across a summer sky, she appeared like a vision of something altogether beyond mere woman, and as the little gross, sensual man who had been her father looked at her, a sudden unnameable terror overcame him. His limbs shook, his brain reeled. Within himself a frightened sense of something supernatural paralyzed his will, and he made for the door like a man groping in the dark. She threw it open for him with a queenly gesture of dismissal, "Tell my mother," she said, "that her daughter is truly alive and that she has kissed you. Not as the old, but as the young Diana. Don't forget." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Young Diana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Young Diana by Marie Corelli. Chapter 25. The chaotic condition of mind into which Mr. Polydore May found himself plunged by what to him was the inexplicable and crazy conduct of the inexplicable and crazy young woman who so obstinately maintained her right to consider herself his daughter, was nothing to the well-nigh raving state of Captain the Honourable Reginald Cleeve, who was faced with a still more intolerable position. He, when he had first called upon Diana as she had invited him to do, experienced something in the nature of a thunderclap when she explained, with much gracious, albeit cold composure, that she was his former betrothed whom he had jilted for a younger and wealthier woman. If he had been suddenly hypnotized by a remorseless conjurer, he could not have been more stricken into speechless and incredulous amazement. He sat in a chair opposite to his fair and smiling informant, staring helplessly, while she, having had tea brought in, prepared him a cup with hospitable ease and condescension. "When you got the note I left for you at the hotel," she said, "surely you recognized my handwriting?" Still staring, he moistened his dry lips with his tongue and tried to speak. "Your handwriting?" he stammered. I thought it very like the handwriting of another Diana May I used to know." "Yes, another Diana May," she said, bending her grave, clear eyes upon him. "A Diana May whose life you ruthlessly spoiled, whose trust in men and things you murdered. And why? Because you met a woman with more money, who was younger than I, who had aged through waiting patiently for you, as you had asked me to do. Because you thought that by the time you returned from India I should be what society calls passé. And for such callous and selfish considerations as these, you deliberately sacrificed my happiness. But I have been given a strange and unexpected vengeance. Look at your wife, and look at me. Which now is the younger of the two?" He moved uneasily. There was something in her aspect that stabbed him as though with physical force and pain. You must certainly know you are talking nonsense," he said at last, trying to pull himself together. "Yours is the queerest craze I ever heard of. Here are you, a beautiful young girl in the very dawn of womanhood, pretending to be a middle-aged spinster who was accidentally drowned last year off the coast of Devon. I don't know how you've come by the same name as hers, or why your handwriting should resemble hers. It's mere coincidence, no doubt, but that you should actually declare yourself as one and the same identity with hers is perfectly ridiculous. I don't deny that you seem to have got hold of the other Diana May's story. I was engaged to her, that's true, but I had to be away in India longer than was at first intended. 7 years, nearly. And 7 years is a long time to keep faith with a woman who doesn't grow younger." "Doesn't grow younger? Yes, I see," echoed Diana with an enigmatical smile. "And 7 years is a long time for a woman to keep faith with a man under the same circumstances. You have not grown younger?" He reddened. His personal vanity as an officer and a gentleman was far greater than that of any woman. "If we live, we are bound to grow older," he said. "Sometimes," acquiesced Diana pleasantly. "It is not always necessary. In my case, for example." Looking at the fair and youthful outline of her features, the sense of extreme incongruity between what she actually was and what she resolutely avowed herself to be touched his innermost sense of humour, and he laughed outright. "Of course, you are playing," he said, "playing with yourself and me. You must be one of those queer psychists who imagine they are re-embodied spirits of the past. But I don't mind if that sort of thing really amuses you. Only I wonder you don't imagine yourself to be the reincarnation of some fairy princess, or even the Diana who was the goddess of the moon, rather than an ordinary spinster of the British middle class, who, even in her best days, was nothing more than the usual type of pretty English girl, to whom you wrote a good deal of gush in your time, said Diana composedly, which she was fool enough to believe. Do you remember this letter? From a quaint blue velvet bag hanging at her side by a silver chain, she drew a folded paper and handed it to him. With eyes that grew hot and dim in giddy perplexity, he read his own writing. "How I love you, my own sweet little Diana! You are to me the most adorable girl in the world, and if ever I do an unkind thing to you, or wrong you in any way, may God punish me for a treacherous brute. My one desire in life is to make you happy." His hand, the massive, veiny hand of a man accustomed to do himself well, trembled, and the paper shook between his fingers. "Where did you get this?" he asked unsteadily. It was written quite a long time ago." "You sent it to me," replied Diana. "I returned all your other letters, but I kept that one. And this." Another note was drawn daintily out from the blue velvet bag, and she handed it to him with a smile. Again his burning eyes travelled along his own familiar scrawl. "I am quite sure you will understand that time has naturally worked changes in you, as well as in myself, and I am obliged to confess that the feelings I had for you no longer exist. But you are a sensible woman, and you are old enough now to realize that we are better apart." He lifted his head and tried to look at her. She met his shifting gaze with a clear and level splendour of regard that pierced his very soul with a subconscious sense of humiliation and conviction. Yet it was not possible for him to believe her story. The whole suggestion was too fantastic and incredible. He gave her back the letters. She took them from his hand. "Well," she said tentatively. "Well," he rejoined, then forced a difficult smile. "I wrote these things, certainly, but how you came by them I don't know. Though, after all, you might easily have met the other Diana May, and she might have given you her confidence." "And her lover's letters to keep?" said Diana contemptuously. "So like her! Reginald Cleeve, you said just now that I was playing with you and with myself. Believe me, I never was further from play in my life. I'm in deadly earnest. I want—" She paused and laughed, then added, "I only want what I can have for the asking. You." He sprang up from his chair and came nearer to her, his face aglow with ardour. She motioned him back. "Not yet," she said, and the seductive beauty of her face and form smote him, as with a whip of steel. "It isn't love at first sight, you know, like that of Romeo and Juliet. We are old lovers. And you are married." "What does that matter?" he said defiantly. "No man considers himself bound nowadays by the matrimonial tie." "No?" she queried sweetly. "I'm so glad to know that. It makes me doubly thankful that I never married you." He made a closer step to her side and caught both her hands in his. "Do you still persist," he said, "in your idea that you are the old Diana, the woman I was engaged to, you a mere girl?" She smiled most entrancingly up into the feverish eyes that searched her face. "I still persist," she answered. "I have always loved telling the truth, no matter how unpleasant. I am the old Diana to whom you were engaged, and whom you heartlessly threw over. Her and no other. As old as ever in years, though not in looks." His grasp of her tightened. "Then in heaven's name have your own way, you beautiful, crazed creature," he said passionately. "If that is your obsession or fancy, stick to it, and come back to me." She loosened her hands. He tried to hold them, but they seemed to melt from his clasp in the most curious and uncanny way, like melting snow. Drawing herself apart, she stood looking at him. "Come back to you?" she echoed. "I never left you. It was you who left me, for no fault. And now I suppose you would leave your wife, also for no fault except, perhaps—" and she laughed lightly, "that of too much general weightiness. But she has given you children. Are you not proud and happy to be the father of a family? Your daughters are certainly very plain, but you must not go by outward appearances." Her lovely face dimpled with smiles, her brilliant eyes, full of a compelling magnetism, filled him with a kind of inward rage. He gave a gesture of mingled wrath and pain. "You are quite unlike the old Diana," he said bitterly. "She was the gentlest of creatures. She would never have mocked me." A rippling peal of laughter broke from her. Laughter that was so cold and cutting that its very vibration on the air was like the tinkling of ice drops on glass. "True," she said. "She was too gentle by half. She was meek and patient, devoted, submissive and loving. She believed in a man's truth, honour and chivalry. Yes, the poor old Diana had feeling and emotions, but the young Diana has none." The afternoon sunshine pouring through the window bathed her figure in a luminance so dazzling and made of her such a radiant vision of exquisite perfection that he was fairly dazzled, while the same uneasy sense of the supernatural troubled him as it had troubled Mr. James Polydore May. "Well, if you will talk like this," he said almost reproachfully, "I had better not trouble you with my company. You said you wanted me." "So I do," she rejoined. "I want you very much, but not just now. You can go, but come again soon. However, I need not ask you. You are sure to come, and you need not tell your wife to call upon me. I will dispense with that formality. I prefer to ignore your family. Au revoir." She stretched out her hand, a little lovely hand like that of the marble Psyche, and hardly knowing what he did, he covered it with kisses. She smiled. "There, that will do," she said. "Another time." She gave him a look that shot like lightning from her eyes into his brain, and set it in a whirl. "Diana!" He uttered the name as if it were a prayer. "Another time," she said in a low, sweet tone. "And quite soon. But go now." He left her reluctantly, his mind disquieted and terrorized. Some potent force appeared to have laid hold of his entire being, drawing every nerve and muscle as if by a strong current of electricity. In a dim sort of way he was afraid. But of what? This he could not formulate to himself, but when he had gone out of her presence he was aware of a strange and paralyzing weakness and tiredness, sensations new to him, and, as he was a great coward where any sort of illness was concerned, alarming. And yet, such was the hold her beauty had on him, that he had made up his mind to possess it or die in the attempt. All the men he knew about town were infatuated with the mere glimpse of the loveliness which flashed upon them like the embodiment of light from another and fairer world, and there was not one among them who did not secretly indulge in the same hope as himself. But the craze or obsession, or whatever it was that dominated her, as he thought, gave him a certain advantage over her other admirers. For if she really believed he had formerly been her lover, then surely there was something in her which would draw her to him through the mere fancy of such a possibility. Like all men who are largely endowed with complacent self-satisfaction, he was encased in a hide of conceit too thick to imagine that with the obsession, as he considered it, which she entertained, might also go the memory of his callous treatment of her in the past, entailing upon him a possible though indefinable danger. She, meanwhile, after he had gone, sat down to think. A long mirror facing her gave her the reflection of her own exquisite face and figure, but her expression for the moment was cold and stern, as that of some avenging goddess. She looked at her hands, the hands her traitor lover had kissed, and opening a quaint jar of perfume on the table beside her, she dashed some of its contents over their delicate whiteness. "For he has soiled them," she said. "They are outraged by his touch." A deep scorn gathered in her eyes like growing darkness. "Why should I trouble myself with any vengeance upon him?" she asked herself inwardly. "A mere lump of sensuality. A man who considers no principle save that of his own pleasure, and has no tenderness or memory for me as the old spinster whom he thought and still thinks, was drowned in Devon. What is he to me but an utterly contemptible atom? And yet, the only sentiment I seem to be capable of now is hate, undying hate, the antithesis of the once undying love I bore him. The revolt of my soul against him is like a revolt of light against darkness. Is he not punished enough by the gross and commonplace domestic life he has made for himself? No, not enough to hurt him. She drew a long breath, conscious of the power which filled her body and spirit, a power which now, for the first time, seemed, to herself, terrific. She knew there was pent up within her a lightning force which was swift to attract, and equally swift to destroy. Those old Greek stories of gods and goddesses whose unveiled glory slew the mortals who dared to doubt them were quite true prophecies, she thought. Only they did not penetrate far enough into the myth to discover the real scientific truth of how the mortal could put on immortality. Not even now, though the fusion and transmutation of elements every day discloses more and more marvels of nature, they have not tested the possibilities of change which science may bring about in the composition of human bodies. That is for the future to discover and determine. At that moment Mrs. Beresford entered the room with a telegram. "For you, Diana," she said. "It has just come." Opening it, Diana read the message it brought. "Professor Chauvet has died suddenly. Has left you his sole heiress. Please meet me in Paris as soon as possible to settle business. Your presence necessary. Reply, Hotel Windsor. Demetrius." The paper dropped from her hands. She had forgotten Professor Chauvet altogether. The crusty yet kindly old professor who had asked her to marry him. She had actually forgotten him. And now he was dead. She sat amazed and stricken till the gentle voice of Mrs. Beresford roused her. "Anything wrong, my dear?" "Oh, no, yet, yes, perhaps a little. A friend has died suddenly, very suddenly, and he has made me his heiress." Mrs. Beresford smiled a little. "Well, isn't that good news?" For the first time since her awakening under the fiery ordeal of Demetrius's experiment, she experienced a painful thrill of real feeling. "No, I am sorry," she said. "I thought I should never feel sorry for anything, but I forgot and neglected this friend, and perhaps, if I had remembered, he might not have died." A beautiful softness and tenderness filled her eyes, and Mrs. Beresford thought she had never seen or imagined any creature half so lovely as she looked. "We must go to Paris," she said. "We can easily start tomorrow. I will answer this wire, and then write." She penciled a brief reply. "Deeply grieved. Will come as soon as possible. Diana." And ringing the bell, bade the servant who answered the summons take it to the telegraph office and send it off without delay. "Yes, I am very sorry," she said again to Mrs. Beresford. "I reproach myself for needless cruelty." Mrs. Beresford, mild-eyed and grey-haired, looked at her half timidly, half affectionately. "I'm afraid, my dear, you are cruel. Just a little," she said. "You make havoc in so many hearts, and you do not seem to care." Diana shrugged her shoulders. "Why should I care?" she retorted. "The havoc you speak of is merely the selfish desire of men to possess what seems to them attractive. It goes no deeper." Then, noting Mrs. Beresford's rather pained expression, she smiled. "I seem hard, don't I? But I have had experience. You? My dear, you are so young." And her kindly chaperone took her hand and patted it soothingly. "When you are older you will think very differently. When you love someone—" "When I love!" And the beautiful eyes shone glorious as light beams. "Ah, then! Why, then, the sun will grow cold, and the leaves of the Judgment Book will most certainly be unrolled." That night she came to a sudden resolve to put away all her formerly cherished ideas of revenging herself on Reginald Cleeve. Standing before her mirror, she saw her own beauty transfigured into a yet finer delicacy when this determination became crystallized, as it were, in her consciousness. "What is my positive mind?" she asked herself. "It is a pole of attraction, which has through the forces of air, fire and water learned to polarize atoms into beautiful forms. It organizes itself, but it is also a center which radiates power over a world of visible effects, so that if I choose I can vitalize or devitalize other forms. In this way I could inflict punishment on the traitor who spoiled my former life. But I live another life, now, in which he has no part. This being so, why should I descend to pulverize base clay with pure fire? He will meet his punishment now without any further effort of mine beyond that which I demand of justice." She raised her hand appealingly, as though she were a priestess invoking a deity. Then, turning to her writing table, she penned the following lines. "To Reginald Cleeve. I am summoned unexpectedly to Paris on business, and the chances are that I shall not see you again. All that I have told you is absolutely true, no matter how much you may disbelieve the story. I am the woman you once pretended to love, and whose life you spoiled, and I am the woman whom you love now, or, to put it roughly, whom you desire, but whose life you can never spoil again. Out of sight, out of mind, and when you read this, it is probable I shall have gone away, which is a good thing for your peace and safety. You have a wife, you are the father of a family. Be content with the domestic happiness you have chosen, and fulfill the responsibilities you have accepted. Goodbye, and think of me no more except as the old Diana." Now, when this letter reached Captain the Honourable Reginald Cleeve at his club, to which it was addressed, and where he had dined on the evening of the day it was posted, which was the next but one to the day of his interview with Diana, it was brought to him in the smoking-room, and as his eyes ran over it he uttered an involuntary oath of such force that even men inured to violent language looked up, amused and inquisitive. "What's up?" asked an acquaintance seated near him. "Oh, nothing. A done," he answered. Then, calming down, he lit a cigar. After a few puffs at it, he took up a newspaper, read a paragraph or two, then laid it down. "By the way," he said to the man who had spoken, "the famous beauty, Diana May, is off to Paris." These words created a certain stir in the smoking-room. Several men looked up. "Oh, well, all lovely women go to Paris for their clothes." "Pardon," said a dark-visaged young man, coming forward from a corner where he had been writing a letter and speaking with a foreign accent. "Did I hear you mention a lady's name, Diana May?" Cleeve glanced him over with military frigidity. "I did mention that name, yes." "Excuse me, I am a stranger in London, and a friend has made me an honorary member of this club for a short time. I knew a Miss Diana May in Geneva. Permit me." And he proffered his visiting card, on which was inscribed Marchese Luigi Farnese. "I met Miss May," he continued, "at the house of a very distinguished Russian scientist, Dr. Fyodor Dmitrius. She had come from England on a visit to his mother, so I was informed. But I had an idea at the time that she had arrived in answer to an advertisement he had put in the Paris newspapers for a lady assistant. Of course I may have been wrong. She was a very bright, rather clever middle-aged person." "The Miss May I spoke of just now," interpolated Cleeve, "is quite a young girl, not more than 18 or 19. "Oh, then," and Farnese made a profoundly apologetic bow, "it cannot be the same. The lady I met was, 35 or so, perhaps 40. She left Geneva very suddenly, and I have been trying to trace her ever since." "May I ask why?" inquired Cleeve. "Certainly. I have for long been interested in the scientific investigations of Dr. Dmitrius. He is a very mysterious person, and I fancied he might be trying some experiment on this lady, Miss May. She gave me no idea of such a thing. She was quite a normal, cheerful person. Still, I had my suspicions and I was curious about it. She went with him and his mother to winter at Davos Platz. I was unable to follow them there as I had a pressure of business. But I heard from a friend that Miss May was the belle of the season. This rather surprised me, as she was not young enough to be a belle unless—" Here he paused and uttered the next words with singular emphasis. "Demetrius had made her so." Cleeve uttered a sharp exclamation and then checked himself. "This is not an age of fairy tales," he said curtly. "No, it is not, but it is an age of science in which fairy tales are realized," rejoined Farnese. "But pray excuse me, I am detaining you. You could not by chance give me the address of this young lady you speak of? The Miss Diana May you know?" "I do not consider myself entitled to do so," answered Cleeve coldly, "without her consent." Farnese bowed. I entirely understand. If you should see her, you will, perhaps, do me the kindness to mention my name and ask if she has ever heard it before. I will certainly do that, agreed Cleeve, whereupon they parted, Captain the Honourable with his mind in a giddy whirl, and his passions at fever heat. Come what would, he must see Diana before she went to Paris. He must ask her about this Demetrius, for the story he had just heard seemed to hang together with her own fantastic obsession. But no, 10,000 times no. It was not, it could not be possible that the old Diana could thus have been miraculously transformed. Even science must have its limits. He glanced at his watch. It was past 9 o'clock, very late for a call, yet he would risk it. Taking a cab, he was driven with all speed to Diana's flat. The servant who opened the door to him looked at him in surprise. "Miss May and Mrs. Beresford have gone to Paris," she said. "They left this evening by the night boat train." He retreated, baffled and inwardly furious. For one moment he was recklessly moved to follow them across Channel next morning. Then he remembered, with rather an angry shock, that he was the father of a family. Convention stepped in and held up a warning finger. No, it wouldn't do, he ruminated vexedly. She, here he alluded to his fat wife, she would make the devil's own row, and I have enough of her sulks as it is. I'd better do nothing, and just wait my chance. But that exquisite Diana, what is she? I must know. I must be off with the old love before I'm on with the new. But is she old? That's the puzzle. Is she the old or a young Diana? This was a question which was destined never to be answered, so far as he was concerned. Diana had gone from him, gone in that swift, irrecoverable way which happens when one soul, advancing onward to higher planes of power, is compelled to leave another of grosser make, even though that other were lover or friend, to wallow in the styes of sensual and material life. She, clothed in her vesture of fire and light, as radiant as any spirit of legendary lore, was as far removed from the clay man of low desires as the highest star from the deepest earth. And though he did not know this, and never would have been able, had he known, to realize the forceful vitality of her existence, the same strange sense of physical weakness, tiredness, and general incapacity which had before alarmed him came upon him now with such overwhelming weight that he could hardly drag his limbs across the fashionable square in which his own house was situated. A great helplessness possessed him, and a thought, bitter as wormwood and sharp as flame, flashed through his brain. I am getting old. It was a thought he always put away from him, but just now it bore down upon him with a kind of thunderous gloom. Yes, he was getting old. He, who had more or less contemptuously considered the age of the woman he had callously thrown over sufficient cause for the rupture. He, too, was likely to be left out in the cold by the hurrying tide of warmer, quicker, youthful life. The vision of the radiant eyes, the exquisite features, the rose-leaf skin, and the supple, graceful form of the marvellous Diana, who so persistently declared herself to be his former betrothed, floated before him in tempting, tantalizing beauty, and as he opened his own house door with his latch-key to enter that abode of domestic bliss where his unwieldy wife talked commonplaces all day long and bored him to death, he uttered something like a groan. "Oh, whatever her fancy or craze may be," he said, "she is young, young and perfectly beautiful. It is I who am old." End of chapter 25. Epilogue of The Young Diana. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Young Diana by Marie Corelli. Epilogue. It was night in Paris, a heavy night, laden with the almost tropical heat and languor common to the end of an unusually warm summer. The street lamps twinkled dimly through vapour which seemed to ooze upwards from the ground, like smoke from the fissures of a volcano, and men walked along listlessly with heads uncovered to the faint and doubtful breeze, some few occasionally pausing to glance at the sky, the aspect of which was curiously divided between stars and clouds, brilliancy and blackness. From the southern side of the horizon a sombre mass of purple-grey shadows crept slowly and stealthily onward, blotting out by gradual degrees the silvery glittering of Orion, and drawing a nun-like veil over the full-orbed beauty of the moon, while at long intervals a faint roll of thunder suggested the possibility of an approaching storm. But the greater part of the visible heavens remained fair and calm, some of the larger planets sparkling lustrously with strange, flashing fire gleams of sapphire and gold, and seeming to palpitate like immense jewels swung pendant in the vast blue dome of air. In the spacious marble court of a certain great house in the Avenue Bois de Boulogne, the oppressive sultriness of the night was tempered by the delicious coolness of a fountain in full play, which flung a quivering column of snow-white against the darkness, and tinkled its falling drops into a bronze basin below, with a musical softness as of far-distant sleigh-bells. The court itself was gracefully built after Athenian models. Its slender Ionic columns supported a domed roof, which by daylight would have shown an exquisite sculptured design, but which now was too dimly perceived for even its height to be guessed. Beyond the enclosure stretched the vague outline of a garden which adjoined the Bois, and here there were tall trees and drooping branches that moved mysteriously now and then, as though touched by an invisible fingertip. Within each corner of the court great marble vases stood, brimming over with growing blossoms. Pale light, streaming from an open window or door in the house, shed a gleam on some statue of a god or goddess half hidden among the flowers. And here, in this cool quietness of stately and beautiful surroundings sat, or rather reclined, Diana, on a cushioned bench, her head turned towards her sole companion, Feodor Demetrius. He sat in a lounge-chair opposite to her, and his dark and brilliant eyes studied her fair features with wistful gravity. "I think I have told you all," he said, speaking in slow, soft tones. "Poor Chauvet's death was sudden, but from his written instructions I fancy he was not unprepared. He has no relatives, and he must have found great consolation in making his will in your favour, for he cared very greatly for you. He told me he had asked you to marry him." Diana moved a little restlessly. As she did so a rosy flash glittered from a great jewel she wore round her neck, the famous Eye of Rajuna, whose tragic history she had learned from Chauvet himself. "Yes," she answered, "that is true, but I forgot." "You forgot?" he echoed wonderingly. "You forgot a proposal of marriage? And yet, when you came to me first in Geneva, you thought love was enough for everything. Your heart was hungry for love." "When I had a heart, yes," she said. "But now I have none, and I do not hunger for what does not exist. I am sorry I forgot the kind professor, but I did, completely, and that he should have left me all he possessed is almost a punishment." "You should not regard it as such," he answered. "It is hardly your fault if you forgot. Your thoughts are, perhaps, elsewhere?" He paused, but she said nothing. "As I have told you," he went on, "Chauvet has left you an ample fortune, together with this house and all it contains, its unique library, its pictures and curios, to say nothing of his famous collection of jewels, worth many thousands of pounds, and as everything is in perfect order you will have no trouble. Personally, I had no idea he was such a wealthy man." She was still silent, looking at him more or less critically. He felt her eyes upon him, and some impulse stung him into sudden fervour. "You look indifferent," he said, "and no doubt you are indifferent. Your nature now admits of no emotion, but, so far as you are woman, your circumstances are little changed. You are as you were when you first became my subject, of mature years and alone in the world without claims on your time or your affections. Is it not so?" A faint, mysterious smile lifted the corners of her lovely mouth. "It is so," she answered. "You are alone in the world. Alone, alone, alone," he repeated with a kind of fierce intensity. "Alone, for I know that neither your father nor your mother recognize you. Am I right or wrong?" Still smiling, she bent her head. "Right, of course," she murmured with delicate irony. "How could you be wrong?" "Your own familiar friend will have none of you," he went on with almost angry emphasis. "To the world you once knew, you are dead. The man who was your lover, the man who, as you told me, spoilt your life and on whom you seek to be revenged." She lifted one hand with an interrupting gesture. "That is finished," she said. "I seek vengeance no longer. No man is worth it. Besides, I am avenged." She half rose from her reclining attitude, and he waited for her next word. "I am avenged," she went on in thrilling accents, "and in a way that satisfies me. My lover that was, never a true lover at best, is my lover still, but with such limitations as are torture to a man whose only sense of love is desire. My beauty fills him with longing. The thought of me ravages his soul and body. It occupies every thought and every dream, and with this passion comes the consciousness of age. Age, the great breakdown, the end of all for him. I have willed that he shall feel its numbing approach every day, that he shall know the time is near when his step shall fail, his sight grow dim, when the rush of youthful life shall pass him by and leave him desolate. Yes, I am avenged. He is old enough now to realize that we are better apart." Her eyes glowed like stars, her whole face was radiant. Demetrius gazed at her almost sternly. "You are pitiless," he said. She laughed. "As he was, yes." And rising to her full height, she stood up like a queen. She wore a robe of dull amber stuff interwoven with threads of gold. A small circlet of diamonds glittered in her hair, and Chauvet's historic Eastern jewel, the Eye of Rajuna, flamed like fire on her white neck. "Theodore Demetrius," she said, and her voice had such a marvellously sweet intonation that he felt it penetrate through every nerve. "You say, and you say rightly, that so far as I am woman, my circumstances are not changed from what they were when I first came to you in Geneva, but only so far as I am woman. Now, how do you know I am woman at all?" He lifted himself in his chair, gripping both arms of it with clenched, nervous hands. His dark eyes flashed a piercing inquiry into hers. "What do you mean?" he half whispered. What would you make me believe?" She smiled. "Oh, marvellous man of science!" she exclaimed. "Must I teach you your own discovery? You, who have studied and mastered the fusion of light and air, with elemental forces and the invisible whirl of electrons with perpetually changing forms, must I, your subject, explain to you what you have done? You have wrested a marvellous secret from nature. You can unmake and remake the human body, freeing it from all gross substance, as a sculptor can mould and unmould a statue. And do you not see that you have made of me a new creature? No longer of mere mortal clay, but of an ethereal matter which has never walked on earth before, and with which earth has nothing in common? What have such as I to do with such base trifles as human vengeance or love?" He sprang up and approached her. "Diana," he said slowly, "if this is true, and may God be the arbiter, one thing in your former circumstances is altered. You are not without claims on your time and your affections. I claim both. I have made you as you are. You are mine." She smiled proudly and retreated a step or two. "I am no more yours," she said, "than are the elements of which your science has composed the new and youthful vesture of my unchanging soul. I admit no claim. When I served you as your subject, you were ready to sacrifice my life to your ambition. Now, when you are witness to the triumph of your experiment, you would grasp what you consider as your lawful prize. Self. All self. But I have a self as well. And it is a self independent of all save its own elements. He caught her hands suddenly. Love is in all elements, he said. There would be no world, no universe without love. Her eyes met his as steadily as stars. There is no such thing as love in all mankind, she said. The race is cruel, destructive, murderous. What men call love is merely sex attraction, such as is common to all the animal world. Children are to be born in order that man may be perpetuated. Why, one cannot imagine. His civilizations perish. He himself is the merest grain of dust in the universe, unless he learns to subdue his passions and progresses to a higher order of being on this earth, which he never will. All things truly are possible, save man's own voluntary uplifting. And without this uplifting there is no such thing as love. He still held her hands. May I not endeavour to reach this height? He asked, and his voice shook a little. Have patience with me, Diana. You have beauty, wealth, youth. She interrupted him. You forget. Mature years are in my brain and heart. I am not really young. You are, he rejoined. Younger than you can as yet realize. You see your own outward appearance, but you have had no time yet to test your inward emotions. I have none, she said. He dropped her hands. Not even an angel's attribute? Mercy? A faint sigh stirred her bosom where the great eye of Rajuna shone like a red star. Perhaps, she said. I do not know. It may be possible. Today in Paris, one of the loveliest women in the world holds undisputed sway as a reigning beauty. The old, now the young, Diana is the envy of her sex and the despair of men. Years pass over her and leave no change in her fair face or radiant eyes. A creature of light and magnetic force, she lives for the most part the life of a student and recluse, and any entertaining of society in her house is rare, though the men of learning and science, who were friends of Professor Chauvet, are always welcomed by their adorable hostess, who to them has become a centre of something like worship. So far as she herself is concerned, she is untouched by either admiration or flattery. Each day finds her further removed from the temporary joys and sorrows of humanity, and more enwrapped in a strange world of unknown experience to which she seems to belong. She is happy because she has forgotten all that might have made her otherwise. She feels neither love nor hate, and Feodor Demetrius, now alone in the world, his mother having passed away suddenly in her sleep, wanders near her, watchfully, but more or less aimlessly, knowing that his beautiful experiment has outmastered him, and that in the mysterious force wherewith his science has endowed her, she has gone beyond his power. His claim upon her lessens day by day, rendering him helpless to contend with what he imagined he had himself created. The Marchese Farnese, catching a passing glimpse of her in Paris, became so filled with amazement that he spread all sorts of rumours respecting her real age, and the magic art of Demetrius, none of which were believed, of course, but which added to the mystery surrounding her, though she herself never condescended to notice them. To this day she holds herself apart and invisible to all save those whom she personally chooses to receive. No man can boast of any favour at her hands, not even Demetrius. And, as was said at the beginning of this veracious narrative, there is no end for Diana May. She lives as the light lives, fair and emotionless, as all may live who master the secret of living, a secret which, though now apparently impregnable, shall yield itself to those who, before very long, will grasp the flaming sword and take and eat of the fruit of the tree of life. The sword turns every way, but the blossom is behind the blade. And in this great effort neither the love of man nor the love of woman have any part, nor any propagation of an imperfect race, for those who would reach the goal must relinquish all save the realization of that new heaven and new earth, of splendid and lasting youth and vitality when old things are passed away. End of Epilogue. And end of The Young Diana by Marie Corelli. Thank you for listening.